At first glance, he looked like just another government bureaucrat. Neat suit, glasses, polished speech. A man who never pulled a trigger, but whose signature set entire systems in motion. Systems more efficient and deadly than any weapon. And that's exactly why he was feared, even long after the war was over. Adolf Eichmann was one of the masterminds behind the vast machinery of population displacement during World War II. His name was the one stamped on the orders. Not orders to attack cities or fire weapons, but to coordinate transportation routes, schedules, and quotas. He turned mass deportations into timetables. He didn't lead armies. He didn't hold a rifle. His weapon was paperwork, logistics, silence. When the Third Reich fell and many of his comrades were arrested or killed, Eichmann disappeared. He assumed a new identity, forged documents, and quietly slipped across continents. While Europe was still reeling from loss, he was settling into a calm, anonymous life under the name Ricardo Clement in the suburbs of Buenos Aires. People whispered his name. His victims remembered. So did survivors, lawyers, and agents. But Eichmann remained a ghost. Invisible. Unreachable. Was he still alive? Had he escaped justice forever? Or was he hiding in plain sight? Then, nearly 15 years later, came a whisper. A sliver of light through a sealed door. A quiet street. An ordinary Argentine family. A reclusive man who always avoided cameras, moved cautiously, kept to himself. It was him. The man the world had once called a ghost, and whom Israel and history itself could no longer ignore. 1956 to 1957, Buenos Aires. Sylvia Hermann was a young woman living a quiet life in Argentina. Her father, Lothar Hermann, was a blind Jewish émigré from Germany, a man who had survived the horrors of the war and fled to South America with his family, hoping to leave the past behind. At a local social event, Sylvia met a boy. His name was Nicholas. Charming, confident, maybe a little smug. He said his last name was Clement. They went for walks, watched movies, exchanged long conversations. But with time, something in the way he spoke changed. There was a heaviness, strange little remarks, hints of something darker. One evening, sitting on a bench in a quiet park, Nicholas leaned in with a sly smile and said, almost joking, almost proud, "My father, he's a great man. In Germany, he was highly respected. He still is. You'll hear his name one day." Sylvia laughed nervously. "What's his name?" she asked, half playful. Nicholas looked her straight in the eyes. His tone shifted. Adolf. Adolf Eichmann. The air changed. It was the kind of name that doesn't just land. It lingers. A name that sucked the sound out of the night. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't joking. Sylvia said nothing. She didn't know if it was true or if he was just trying to impress her with some weird, edgy claim. But later that night, back home, she told her father. Sylvia's father, Lothar Hermann, was not an ordinary man. Blinded after surviving torture at the Dachau concentration camp, he had fled Europe and resettled in Argentina, trying to live out the rest of his life in peace. But his mind never forgot. He remembered the names. He remembered the structure, and he knew one name had never been crossed off any list: Adolf Eichmann. When Sylvia told him what her boyfriend had said, that his father's real name might be Eichmann, Lothar didn't laugh it off. He didn't hesitate. He saw a signal, and he acted. He sat down and wrote a letter. Not to local police, not to any Argentine authority, but directly to Fritz Bauer, a bold and respected prosecutor in Frankfurt, known for hunting former Nazis when no one else would. In that letter, Lothar wrote, "A man named Ricardo Clement is living in San Fernando, a suburb of Buenos Aires. My daughter's boyfriend, Nicholas, says this man is his father. His behavior, his background, everything suggests he might be Adolf Eichmann." Bauer didn't hesitate either. He didn't trust the German police. Too many looked the other way when it came to old cases. Instead, he quietly passed the information to Israeli intelligence, straight to Mossad, bypassing official German channels altogether. And just like that, Israel had what it needed: a name, a city, a lead. More than that, a mistake. Eichmann's own son may have casually, carelessly revealed a secret the world had been chasing for 15 years. Within weeks, Mossad agents began arriving in Argentina, each under deep cover, posing as businessmen, tourists, engineers. They didn't knock on doors. They didn't make arrests. They watched. They tailed Ricardo Clement from a distance, photographed him from car windows, studied his gait, his habits, his routes. They even tracked down old voice recordings to compare the sound of his voice to what little audio still existed from the war. Nothing was rushed, because one wrong move could destroy the entire mission. One misstep, and Israel could be caught operating on foreign soil, facing global diplomatic fallout. And then, the final confirmation. Using surveillance photos taken on the street, Israeli analysts back home overlaid Clement's image with old wartime photos of Eichmann. The match was chilling. Same jawline, same cheekbones, same angle of the eyes. Even the faint wrinkles matched. There was no doubt. The man living under the name Clement was Adolf Eichmann, the architect of displacement, the ghost of the Nazi machine. He was alive, and he was about to be found. With his identity confirmed, Mossad launched Phase 2, a question more daunting than identifying a fugitive. How do you take a man from another continent, from a country that has no idea what you're planning, and bring him back without anyone ever noticing? This would be one of the boldest operations in the history of intelligence work. Not a military strike, not a raid, but a surgical extraction, executed like clockwork, without firing a shot. And in a silent room in Jerusalem, behind heavy concrete walls, a plan was beginning to take shape. One Israel had never attempted before. One the world would never forget. A mission with no margin for error, and only one acceptable outcome. They weren't just agents. They were men with memories. Each person on the team had a reason. One had lost his entire family in the war. Another had tracked Eichmann's name through whispers and records for years. And some, they simply understood a basic truth. Some things demand an answer. Some ghosts must be brought into the light. These weren't muscle-bound operatives. They were quiet, patient, precise. Every agent was chosen not for brute strength, but for psychological control. They knew how to wait. They knew how to vanish. They began arriving in Buenos Aires under fake identities, posing as businessmen, engineers, consultants. Each carried a legend, a detailed cover story, and one mission: reconstruct Eichmann's life down to the second. Where did he board the bus? Which gate did he use to enter his house? How did he hold his briefcase? Which foot did he limp on? Did he ever look over his shoulder? And most importantly, when was the street outside his home truly, completely deserted? This wasn't surveillance. It was a live-action simulation of his existence, rebuilt day by day, frame by frame. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of Tel Aviv, in a sealed hangar with no signs on the door, a replica street was being constructed. A model of that very corner in San Fernando. The exact curb, the same street lamp, the bus route, the shadows. And inside that hangar, the team trained. How to stop the car in the exact right place. How two agents would exit simultaneously, block the target, and draw no attention. How to invite Eichmann into the vehicle without panic, without a struggle. How to drive off in under 8 seconds. They rehearsed it all, over and over, day and night, until it looked like instinct, until they moved like one body. And yet, none of that would matter if they couldn't answer the next question. How do you get a man out of a country without anyone ever realizing he was there to begin with? That's where diplomatic cover came in. It just so happened that in May 1960, a delegation from Israel was officially scheduled to visit Argentina to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Argentina's independence. That visit would become the perfect camouflage. The plan? Kidnap Eichmann late at night. Hide him in a safe house for several days. Dress him as a sick member of the Israeli delegation. Walk him onto the plane as though he belonged there. Fly out without customs, without delay, without leaving a trace. It had to be silent, surgical, a ghost extraction. leaving behind nothing but tire tracks. The date was locked in, May 11th, 1960, the day the name Ricardo Clement would disappear from every phone book in Buenos Aires, and Adolf Eichmann would finally return to the world stage. It was the night Israel decided that justice doesn't always wait for a courtroom. Sometimes it has to fly across the ocean and take its seat by force. May 11th, 1960, 8:05 p.m., San Fernando. A dark street named Garibaldi. Darkness. No streetlights. No people. The kind of night where someone could disappear and never return to the life they once had. That's exactly what Mossad was counting on. Adolf Eichmann, living under the name Ricardo Clement, walked home from work like he always did. Same briefcase. Same steady, focused pace. He had no idea what was waiting just meters ahead. In a parked car on the side of the road, where silence sat wound tight like a spring. Inside the vehicle, 2 agents. A third waited behind a tree. A fourth positioned in a backup car at the end of the street. All wore suits. No visible weapons. They looked like anyone, and in seconds, everything would change. 8:10 p.m. Eichmann passed the car. A door opened. Fast. One agent stepped out and put a hand on his shoulder. Another took the briefcase. A third swung the back door open. In less than 10 seconds, Ricardo Clement was in the car. No screaming, no fight. Just silence, and one sentence, soft but final. "If you stay quiet, this will go smoothly." They pulled away, just like that. Within minutes, they were gone from the neighborhood. Half an hour later, the car stopped at a rented safe house, secure, guarded, and prepared by agents who had spent months planning for this very moment. What followed wasn't just containment, it was confirmation. Over the next 10 days, Mossad agents didn't sleep. They ran every test possible to prove beyond doubt that the man in custody was who they believed he was. Facial matches with intelligence archives, old scars, lines on the palms, his voice, his mannerisms, questions only Eichmann would know how to answer, handwriting samples compared to preserved Nazi-era documents from Britain, Poland, and Israel. They couldn't afford a mistake. Not at this level, not with history watching. And the conclusion came in. It was him.
My name is Adolf Eichmann.
The man who had lived as a ghost. The man chased across continents and decades. The man who orchestrated the deportation of millions without ever stepping on a battlefield. Adolf Eichmann was in Israeli custody, and now came the part that no one could have imagined, getting him out of Argentina without the world noticing. May 21st, 1960, Buenos Aires. Newspapers screamed with headlines about the country's 150th Independence Day. Parades, fireworks, foreign delegations, television broadcasts. The entire nation was looking toward the celebration, which meant no one was looking at the shadows. That was Mossad's moment. A few days earlier, a special Israeli diplomatic flight had landed, officially there for the festivities. On board, government officials, aides, and crew. But one passenger was not listed on any manifest. No name, no passport, no past. Eichmann. To smuggle him out undetected, the team executed a flawless high-risk charade. He was dressed in an Israeli flight crew uniform, given a fabricated ID under an alias, his face partially covered by a medical mask. A fake doctor's note declared him a crew member who had suffered a stroke. 2 agents supported him under each arm as he shuffled slowly through the terminal, feigning weakness. Security was minimal, attention was elsewhere, no one looked twice. And within minutes, the cabin doors closed. The plane lifted into the air, history sealed behind it. Officially, the delegation was simply flying home. Unofficially, one of the most wanted men in modern history sat silently in the back, headed toward the courtroom that had waited for him for 2 decades. Argentine authorities hadn't noticed a thing. No exit records under his name. No missing persons alert. No commotion. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, and then, just days later, the world stopped. Israel made the announcement. One of the central figures of the darkest era in modern history has been captured. He is in our custody, and he will stand trial. April 11, 1961, Jerusalem. For the first time in the young history of Israel, a courtroom opened its doors not just to deliver a verdict, but to unlock a flood of memory that had been buried, feared, and ignored for too long. On trial was not a dictator, not a general, not a ranting fanatic, but a man in a gray suit, crisp shirt, polished glasses, calm, unassuming, forgettable. Adolf Eichmann, the man they called the architect of administrative disappearance. The courtroom had been built specifically for this trial, spacious, wired for sound, cameras in place, microphones everywhere, and in the center, like the nucleus of history itself, a bulletproof glass booth. That's where Eichmann sat, expressionless, as though watching someone else's life. The world was watching, reporters, judges, translators, survivors. And for the first time since the Holocaust, those who lived through it would speak, out loud, on record, in front of the world. The prosecution didn't build its case on emotion. They built it on paper. Transport orders, deportation schedules, railroad agreements, typed directives with Eichmann's signature, evacuation plans, disguised as logistics charts. He didn't shoot, he scheduled. He didn't carry a weapon, he carried a clipboard. He didn't scream orders, he submitted memos. And that's what made him so dangerous. His crime was efficiency. They called it a logistical masterpiece. But the cargo was human beings. Hundreds of witnesses entered that courtroom. People with numbers tattooed on their arms, mothers who said goodbye to their children on train platforms, children who never saw their parents again. One by one, they stepped forward. No theatrics, no embellishment. Just the truth, delivered clean, sharp, and final. And in that silence, the world that once turned away now had no choice but to listen. Eichmann's defense was simple. I was just following orders. His lawyers argued he wasn't a leader, just a bureaucrat. He acted within the laws of his country. He didn't choose who went where. He just recorded it. The prosecution hit back, hard. That's not an excuse. That's the system. That's how mass atrocity happens, when no one questions and everyone just obeys. This wasn't just an Israeli trial. It was a global reckoning. A reminder that justice can find those who run from it. A megaphone for those who were silenced for decades. Proof that memory has no borders and no expiration date. Eichmann never admitted guilt. But this trial was never about what he would say. It was about what the world would hear. And finally, after months of testimony, thousands of pages of evidence, and broadcast into homes across every continent, 3 judges looked up at the man in the glass box, and the world held its breath. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. From orchestrating mass deportations to meticulously managing the bureaucratic death machine of the Third Reich, his role had been proven beyond doubt. And so, Israel issued a sentence it had never given before, and has never given since. Death. No appeals, no delays, no second chances. It was the end of one man, but the beginning of something larger. A global understanding that even desk crimes are still crimes, that even following orders has consequences, and that justice, real justice, may be slow, but it is relentless. There were no cameras, no press conferences, no final statements. Israel didn't turn the sentence into a spectacle. It turned it into silence. The kind of silence that once surrounded those who were taken away without names, without goodbyes. Eichmann spent his final days in total isolation. No interviews, no final letters, no remorse. He held fast to the same line until the end. I was only following orders. But the world no longer accepted that. And Israel never did. In June 1962, the sentence was carried out. Inside the most secure prison in the country. No reporters witnessed it. No footage was ever taken. No last words were recorded. His body was cremated. There was no grave, no ashes handed to family, no tombstone to be visited. His remains were scattered over open sea, beyond any border. so that no trace could ever become a monument. No place, anywhere in the world, would bear his name in stone. That's how the story of a man who turned paperwork into a weapon came to an end. He used no guns, no tanks, only schedules, charts, and cold efficiency. And in the end, he disappeared without a trace, just as those he once sent to the trains had vanished decades earlier. But this time, his name would not be forgotten in silence. This time it remained, as a warning. There is no distance far enough to escape justice, and no title or uniform that makes truth untouchable. The search, capture, and trial of Adolf Eichmann wasn't just an intelligence mission. It rewrote the rules of international law, espionage, and memory itself. What seemed impossible became reality, and not for revenge, but for principle. One man spent 15 years avoiding responsibility, and was brought to face it. No border could save him. For intelligence agencies around the world, this was a masterclass in discipline, coordination, and precision. Israel showed that even with limited resources, when the goal is clear, you can pull off one of the most precise, bloodless, and impactful operations in the history of modern espionage. For international law, it was a shockwave. Questions echoed around the world. Does a country have the right to cross another's border to bring a criminal to justice? Can moral accountability ever outweigh diplomatic immunity? The world didn't give a clear answer. But from that moment on, there was precedent. A precedent invoked in The Hague, in UN sessions, in documentaries and classrooms. Not just because Eichmann was captured, but because for the first time truth was brought into daylight. For millions, this was a moment when silenced voices finally spoke. They had been erased from documents, boxed into train cars, left without names. But now, they were heard. In a courtroom, on television, across the world. This wasn't just a trial. It was the voice of history saying, "We remember. We will name the truth, and we will never stay silent again." The Eichmann trial became an ethical landmark, not because of the punishment, but because of the power of truth. Measured, documented, and unbreakable. This story didn't end with an explosion or a bullet. It ended with a verdict, one that the entire world heard and understood. Evil, even when it wears a suit and signs with a stamp, is still evil, and it will be held accountable.